Facing pressure to act on national security and domestic priorities, lawmakers appear more willing to negotiate across issue lines. That includes DHS funding and confirmations, questions about authorizing military operations and funding them, and unresolved bills touching surveillance, housing, and financial policy. To assess whether this moment leads to real progress, I'm joined by Capitol Hill Correspondent for WTOP, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me.
You bet.
Hey, the Senate worked this weekend after a very busy week last week that included the confirmation hearing for Senator Mullen for Secretary of Homeland Security. So let's start with that. How did it go?
You know, I think aside from the personal clash between Kentucky Senator Rand Paul and Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin, everything went pretty well for Republicans. They feel like he is now on a glide path to be confirmed later this week on a Senate vote. Obviously, there was a little bit of fireworks. Very interesting. You rarely see something that personal, especially between senators. Sometimes you see that in the House. But the fact that they had this dispute going back nearly a decade, and basically Markwayne Mullin said some things that Rand Paul thought were basically saying that it was okay to get beaten up by a neighbor in this crazy dispute that he had. And they went at it. So it's pretty rare for the chairman of a committee who is responsible for recommending an administration nominee to go against that nominee in a vote. But it was balanced out by Democrat John Fetterman from Pennsylvania. So I think overall the confirmation hearing went pretty well. While a lot of attention has been given to Markwayne Mullin's propensity for some strong language at times, after all, he's a former MMA fighter, he does also have a reputation as somebody who's very bipartisan. He actually had a Democrat in the room when he was undergoing this hearing. So it's going to be an interesting thing when he actually gets confirmed, because when that happens, it's very likely that he will be confirmed for a Department of Homeland Security that still technically is not funded because we're still in the partial government shutdown. So that's a very unique situation.
He did seem to indicate in his responses to questions that he would make some changes at DHS. Are those going to be enough to break the deadlock on the funding for the agency?
I think that'll play a role in it. I also think what's really important is last week they finally got members of both parties into a room, which they had been talking about doing for quite some time. And they got the border czar Homan in there and said, let's try to talk this out. And the White House has been making some concessions, and Democrats, even though publicly at times have downplayed them, particularly Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Another good sign, frankly, is that when Democrats came out of that meeting with Tom Homan last week, they didn't really say a lot. And that usually indicates that they are making progress and they don't want to jeopardize anything. So this is going to be a critical week, obviously, for getting that done. And obviously also we've seen the lines getting longer and longer at all these major airports across the country, with more than 10% of TSA workers who are not getting paid calling out sick. This is the scenario that you and I had talked about for quite some time, right, and it's finally about to come to a head.
Well, spring break travel is getting a lot of news, as well as the second missed paycheck for TSA folks. So we'll see how they go this week.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think that they feel that they have to really do it this week because Senate Majority Leader John Thune indicated last week that if they don't have anything done by the end of this week, he's going to keep senators in session again this coming weekend until something gets done, because otherwise they're going on break. And a lot of these lawmakers, however they feel about these issues, just don't want this hanging out there, especially during that heavy traveling spring season.
They'll have to get it back through the House, right, before it goes to the president for signature?
They will. So that will also be another bit of drama that we'll have to see how that goes, because there are going to be changes. And so that means it does kick back to the House. I'm sure we'll hear a lot of complaints and the beating of chests about various issues related to that. And then ultimately, I think it will be up to President Trump to get the Republicans in the House in line, which often is what has to happen for it to finally get passed.
I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill Correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, let's shift our focus to Middle East operations. There were a number of hearings about the current operations last week. How did those go?
Well, right now, there is a lot of concern among members of Congress about what the cost is going to be. And we've had a variety of votes in connection with war powers resolutions in the Senate. We're expecting another one in the House this week. And the other thing was we had the top intelligence officials at one of those hearings, of course, the World Threats hearing. And we got a lot of back and forth between especially Democratic lawmakers and Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, who said effectively that DNI is leaving it to the president to determine whether there was an imminent threat. That has left a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of Democrats on the committee. And then there was also the White House floating this $200 billion supplemental funding in part for the war. I think that is going to be in trouble because until we get details of it, a lot of people, including Republicans, are skeptical of the costs. It is also possible that funding could become a big grab-all, if you will, for a lot of other issues. There's matters like farmers, for example, are looking for aid. They've been hurt hard by tariffs. There are a whole host of issues that they are talking about stuffing into a supplemental. Of course, getting that passed is another issue. And as we've talked about, Republicans are still toying with the idea of trying to do it through reconciliation so that they can pass it on their own. However, when you get to a bill that is this big and with all these different competing interests, they know that that's going to be difficult as well. So that's definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on.
It is a big increase. The first initial word about a supplemental was $50 billion, so 4 times as large.
Right. And I asked Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, about that. And he said, look, I'm not going to support this until I get a better explanation about where the end game is for this war with Iran. And that is a feeling among many Democrats. Many on the more liberal side feel even stronger. Senator Warner is more on the centrist side, but even he has a lot of big questions about this.
Well, those are 2 really big topics that both chambers are going to have to deal with this week. But there's a lot of other legislative movement up there. The SAVE Act has been getting a lot of big headlines, and it seems to be driving the broader legislative agenda. Walk us through how members of Congress are considering that and other things like housing and FISA and banking. I mean, they've got a smorgasbord of legislation to consider.
They really do. And that part of the reason that a lot of people were concerned about having the SAVE Act take up all this floor time, which it did over this past weekend and will continue through this week, is that there are all these other issues that are out there. Now, of course, to Republicans, getting a national voter ID is very important. And there's been a really hard push among conservatives to try to get something done here. They feel like they have to make this a priority, especially because it's the top legislative priority for President Trump. But what that also does is it kind of pushes aside a lot of these other key issues that you're talking about. For example, the housing issue, the Senate passed housing legislation, and many consider it the most significant housing legislation in decades. But the problem is the House. There is a lot of concern about what is being done in connection with whether or not there are going to be onerous, at least in the view of GOP lawmakers, new regulations related to getting housing provisions through, for example, community banks. So what they are trying to do is actually do some legislative jujitsu, if you will, and put some of the housing legislation into cryptocurrency legislation, and basically saying, okay, we didn't get this in the Senate bill, but we'll get it in this other bill. So if you have a problem with it, House Republican member, then you can vote for this crypto bill and you'll still get what you want. So that's just one example of kind of the funny things that are taking place legislatively. And then the other one, as you mentioned, Section 702 of the FISA. This has, of course, been a very big issue whenever it comes up for renewal. And what's interesting is a lot of the positioning on that has shifted. For example, one of the key people who used to be opposed to it, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan, last week said that he now says he will vote for an extension of FISA. This would be an 18-month extension of this warrantless surveillance legislation that essentially allows the U.S. to undergo surveillance of people overseas. But there has been concern, particularly among conservatives, as well as liberal Democrats, who say that they worry that Americans can somehow be swept under this and that they may be surveilled. So we'll have to be watching that as well.
Maybe there's a silver lining there. It sounds like some good old-fashioned horse trading going on to get some of these pieces moving.
Right. I mean, that's a great point, because what is legislating but usually horse trading, but there really has been precious little of that in recent years. For some of us, we actually remember these things called conference committees, where you actually had people from both sides of the aisle or both the House and Senate getting together to work out those differences. And we are starting to see a little bit of that. I alluded to that earlier in connection with those talks related to DHS. That's the kind of thing that has to happen. If you're going to get something done where two sides are both backed into their corners, ultimately they have to come out of their corners and they have to compromise. And at least a little bit there, we're starting to see that.
I've been speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill Correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, it sounds like it's going to be a busy week.
It is indeed. Another one coming up.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.